As you may have heard, there's a new drop-top sports car in town. It's the 7th generation Mercedes SL, and it's the first SL to have been developed from the ground up by AMG, meaning it will donate its basic architecture to the upcoming Mark II AMG GT. Yes, this is quite the change in mood music for what is traditionally the loping drop-top of the Mercedes range. And the factory has made no secret of the fact that this brasher roadster has nothing less than the Porsche 911 in its crosshairs. To help it out, the car's been given four-wheel drive for the first time, and has sprouted back seats for a bit more versatility. What we're mostly interested in, though, is the driving experience. Can an SL really be a 911 rival?
So, the new 7th generation Mercedes SL. And before we start talking about the car, just to say, I'm going to keep the roof up because we're in Yorkshire. There's a bit of rain going around. It's pretty cold. You won't be able to hear me. And apologies, we don't choose when these cars come off the production line and end up in the UK. So, first things first, what do we think about the way this car looks? Because if you go back to the 1950s, 60s with the pagoda, 70s, SLs have always had that elegance, haven't they? Probably lost their way a little bit in the last couple of generations. I think Mercedes would admit that as well. But this car is a bit of a reset button for Mercedes. I'll explain why in a moment, but design plays a big part of that. So what do we think? Personally, I quite like the front. I'm definitely not sure about the back, which I think has got a lot of visual weight. There's a lot of bodywork going on, so you don't really get that elegance. For me, the jury's out. You can make up your own minds, but certainly I think from dead on, it's a pretty imposing car. It's not lacking any presence, is it? So what have we got under the bodywork? Mercedes-AMG's 4-litre V8 makes another appearance. We know this engine so well now. It's appeared in numerous AMG products over the last 10 years or so, and it really does give you the full Spitfire experience. Again, we'll talk more about the engine a little bit later, but it's not just a straight transplant. It's got a new oil pan, the intercoolers have been repositioned, and I think they've done some fine-tuning to the intake and the exhaust manifolds. So far, you can get it in 2 states of tune, so that's the SL55, which we've got here, and the SL63. So the 55 is making around 480 brake horsepower, and the 63, which is the current range topper, is making around 670. The engines are basically identical. Inside the cabin, well, it's pleasant. I mean, it's modern Mercedes. There's screens everywhere, including this huge central touchscreen. You'll either love it or you'll hate it, but when it's working, it's pretty slick. We had a bit of latency with this one, but on the whole, I'm not going to be too critical of it because most of the time it works quite well. You sort of got this wraparound dashboard which cocoons you quite nicely, but you don't get the sort of borderline claustrophobic, pillboxy, hunkered down, sat over the rear axle feeling you get in the AMG GT, which I really like actually, but I probably wouldn't want it every day. Driving position, actually really good. Seats are comfortable and supportive. There's plenty of reach in the steering column. You can get decently low, bring the wheel out towards your chest. Now, the important bit, how does this car actually feel on British roads? Well, just to start off, I'll say I did 300 miles in this car yesterday, and it does the GT thing really quite well. This one's on 21-inch wheels, but it's got a really supple, sort of controlled, quite velvety ride quality. If you want a sports car that will do all-day driving, you've absolutely got to be considering this, because it just, as I say, dispatched 300 miles, no problem whatsoever. So much torque from the V8, really comfortable, and also just a nice place to be. I mean, some of the plastics are a little bit, I don't know, flexible. It's not always rock solid quality with modern Mercedes as ever, but in general, it's a pleasant place to be. And as I say, the car does the GT thing well. But what's it actually like to drive? You've got a myriad settings. So at the moment we've had it in comfort, everything relaxed. You can dial it up through sport, Sport Plus, and that's changing your parameters for the engine. So that's your throttle response and exhaust note, obviously. This is an AMG after all. You've got your steering weight, you've got your damper control, so you can incrementally build things up. And I think with AMG, as usual, it's important to sort of buy into the configurability of the car. If you don't, you're probably not going to like this new SL. There's just too much going on. So let's go for Sport. You can put the gearbox in manual mode. And let's have a sports exhaust on as well. So here we go. First thing, I mean, these are really tricky, damp, greasy roads in Yorkshire, and the traction this car generates is absolutely epic. 480 horsepower. I mean, it's not a brain out figure these days, and arguably for 150 grand you might expect this car's power output to start with a 5 or maybe even a 6. But what really matters is the torque, and as ever, this V8 delivers an absolute ton of it. 516 pound-foot, basically always available throughout the rev range. It's not the highest revving engine. Probably don't want to go much higher than 6,000 RPM, to be honest, but wherever you are, you've just got this wall of torque that starts at 2,000 RPM. So you've always got that, and it gives this car, in combination with that amazing traction potential, it means that cross-country, this thing is immensely quick. I'd also say that the rear wheel steering doesn't actually kick in until you're at about 60 miles an hour. So for those second gear, even third gear corners, you're benefiting from the added agility of the rear wheels turning in contrary motion to the fronts. And credit to Mercedes, because it actually feels really natural in this car, and that's not an easy thing to get right. You get the feeling that they learned an awful lot from the AMG GT 4-door, which was just an exercise in calibrating numerous chassis systems that they pulled off seriously well. I think that car's still quite underrated, actually, and unfairly so. The steering, it's precise, it's nicely weighted, it's pretty confidence-inspiring, but I will say this, the AMG GT uses a electro-hydraulic rack, and this car has gone to an electromechanical rack, and you can really tell the difference. So the AMG GT, the steering is a little bit lively, to be honest. It's quite willing to track cambers and so on, fidgets around, but ultimately, once you get comfortable with that, it does dial you into the road, dial you into what the chassis is trying to do really effectively, and that's just missing in this car a little bit. That is probably the first dynamic shortcoming of this car when you look at it in pure sports car terms, which, remember, is how Mercedes is billing this car. That engine, though, dear God, listen to it. Gearbox, generally really good. I mean, it's almost DCT quick most of the time, you've got to say, and yet it's very well mannered in normal driving. What I will say is this, and it's an old bugbear with this gearbox: if you are taking manual control and you try an upshift at around the 7,000 RPM red line, unless you get it just right, if you go even 1 RPM too far, this gearbox just fluffs its lines and it really breaks the flow. I mean, you kind of feel sometimes like it's just worth putting the gearbox in Sport Plus mode and letting it get on with things itself, which it actually does really well. So that's another thing. So steering, gearbox, they're good. For an out-and-out GT car, they're more than good. But for a sports car, there's still something a little bit lacking there. I have to say though, even on these standard semi-active dampers and coil springs, so not the cross-linked hydraulic system in the SL63, this thing is really poised. It sort of builds a really confidence-inspiring base from which to go out and sort of drive the car and chase the throttle and be a bit more aggressive with it. So never in a million years is it something that you'd shy away from on a B road. It's a car that gives you a reason to take the more interesting road. Again, another big box ticked. But what about that four-wheel drive system? Mercedes hasn't released figures on what its sort of potential is in terms of torque split, but it's fully variable, working out what needs to go where in terms of torque between the axles and the road surface, your driving style, and your chassis mode is going to influence the behavior of the car. Like on a damp road like this, the car just seems to prize traction and grip over sort of fluidity and playfulness in a bit of a, I don't know, maybe they're holding something back for the AMG GT. I mean, they are surely holding something back for the AMG GT, but why not give this car just a little bit more flamboyance? I mean, it will play if you want it to, but it just doesn't come quite as naturally as I'd been hoping. I mean, overall, it's clearly a very complete car, a very capable car, and a pretty versatile car too, but there's one thing it can't hide, and that is weight. So, four-wheel drive, rear-wheel steering, longer wheelbase, twin-turbo V8 engine, it all adds up. And I think with fuel and passenger, this is a 1900 kilo plus car, which is, I don't know, it's not very sports car-y, is it? I think probably 200 or 300 kilos over what would be acceptable for a sports car, even a convertible one, which has to take into account the roof mechanism. You do feel that weight. It does. I think ultimately it probably tips the personality of the car into the GT realm quite a lot, actually. It's reassuring in some ways, but sort of inhibits the car's natural vivacity and agility at the same time. It all draws you in, it all gives you plenty of confidence, but ultimately you can't quite get fully immersed in the driving experience and get on top of the SL. I don't know, maybe the 63 will be different. The 63, of course, will have a more sophisticated E-diff in the back, and will have other tricks. I don't know whether they'll be able to help it disguise the weight though. But again, I mean, the ease at which you can just cover ground is ridiculous. I don't know, it's a confusing car. It does a lot of things very well, and what shortfalls there are they're not major faux pas. I mean, conceptually it might have an issue. Are they trying to do too much? Are they trying to make this car too many things? Too much GT, too much sports car, spread too thinly? In trying to tick both boxes, is it actually ticking neither of them?
As we know, ticking boxes is something the current 992 generation of the Porsche 911 does almost without peer, and arguably none more so than the near 500 horsepower Carrera GTS. Fast, pretty, intuitively straightforward to drive day to day. It's not an easy car for the AMG to beat, but no car is infallible, and as we've discovered, the Merc doesn't seem to have any irredeemably bad attributes.
So welcome to the benchmark, which in this case is the Porsche 911 Carrera GTS Cabriolet. It's usefully less expensive than the SL55, but apart from that, the two cars are remarkably similar. This makes 473 horsepower, so it's within touching distance of the AMG. You can also have it in four-wheel drive. This one isn't, but I mean, to be honest, do you need four-wheel drive in the UK? I'm not sure. Maybe if you live in a country where it snows and winter tyres are a thing. I've been going between these two cars for a little bit now, and there's no doubt on a day like today, the AMG is quicker point to point, but I think in general you'd be quite happy with the traction and grip levels of this rear-wheel drive 911, and it has one big advantage over the AMG straight away, and that's weight. This isn't a particularly light sports car, but straight away, gosh, you really feel that weight saving compared to the AMG, just the way the nose moves. And I know there's no front drive shafts in this car, so you've got that much more purity and response and precision, and also a decent amount less unsprung weight, and it all comes through straight away. This thing feels flyweight compared to the AMG. Maybe not immediately quite as assured, but a little bit more open and just welcomes you into the driving experience. And that extends from everything from the driving position, which is a little bit lower. Your hit point feels a little bit lower and further back. I mean, that's sitting over the rear axle is traditionally an AMG coupe hallmark, and one we really like, but you really do feel more embedded in the Porsche, which is nice. Cabin wise, yeah, we're familiar with this cabin by now. It's much more utilitarian than that of the AMG, no surprise there, but it does feel very, very nicely screwed together, and it's just fewer distractions in here. Smaller screens, there's a nice analog rev counter dead ahead of you, red line at 8, red line at 7.5, beautifully proportioned steering wheel, fewer distractions for all day drives, not quite as relaxing as the AMG, but a very nice place to be nonetheless. Gosh, engine though, I mean the V8 in the AMG is just OTT. It's so enthusiastic and so bombastic and big and enjoyable, but this Porsche flat 6, I mean, we all lost our minds, didn't we, when they went turbocharged and downsized the 911's engine. So this is a 3-litre twin turbo unit. Fair to say that a lot of us weren't overjoyed with that, but over the last 5 or 6 years, they've really honed it, and it feels so fat-free now, this engine. The pickup is brilliant. It revs so nicely and cleanly. And there's something else. The GTS actually has its own specific exhaust system. It's just released a little bit of waspish energy from this engine. People will probably fall into one of two camps. If you love the V8 in the AMG and its larger-than-life character is really your thing, then fill your boots. I mean, we're not going to have engines like that for much longer, and it is one of the best. Endless torque, anywhere in the rev range, loads of noise, loads of drama, plenty of performance, even if the SL55 is a little bit lacking for the price point. Or you're going to be won over by the charms of this flat 6 in the 911, because it's not a motorsport division engine, but this engine still feels pedigree and finely tuned. And as I say, fat-free. I mean, you can imagine, a blue-printed engine with such fine tolerances, absolutely no play in it whatsoever. That's what this engine feels like, and it's also quite pneumatic sounding, and so you get a lot of intake roar. You get, lower revs, a little bit of sort of turbo histrionics, just faintly. It's not overdone. So they've both got really great powertrains, these cars. Porsche's also got a substantially bigger contact patch at the back, 305 section tyres on a larger rim. And I've got to say, actually, now it's drying out. We've still got a damp road, but now it's starting to dry out a bit. Sun's come out and loads of traction, loads of confidence. It's a shame that AMG hasn't really put one over the Porsche in terms of steering and feeling really dialed in to the road, because that is probably the one area where the Porsche is a little bit more exposed. Damping, Porsche, it's a firmer car, it's a less supple car, but it's still very, very pliant and controlled. And I think really if you're looking for a car that will do long distance and also take a B-road apart, you really couldn't complain about this ride quality. And that's even with the suspension that's derived from the 911 Turbo, which is what the GTS has, with those rear helper springs. So it feels really complete in that respect. As for the rear wheel steering, this car has it too, and just like in the AMG, it's so well integrated. I mean, there was a second gear hairpin earlier today where maybe the Porsche just felt a touch artificial in the way it rotated round and slung itself out of that corner. But I mean, in general, it's just so well integrated and calibrated. Very natural feeling. The performance as well. I mean, they're both fast cars. They're both really fast cars. And actually, in modern terms, they're both more or less in the sweet spot of what you'd want for like a serious sports car on the road. But the Porsche just feels it's got another level to go to compared to the AMG, which feels a strange thing to say because, you know, big V8 AMGs, straight line performance is normally something that that's something they bring to the party. They're difficult to beat in that respect. But again, maybe it's that SL55 is just a touch under endowed. I don't know. It felt okay, and then you get in the Porsche, and this thing really does shift. So let's boil it down then. If you're doing a lot of long distance stuff, the Merc is pretty hard to beat. This Porsche is great. It's supple, but it's not as supple as the Merc. And also, you got that road roar, which is undeniable. I think this car will do a 300-mile day, no problem. But you'll feel it more than you will in the AMG at the end of the day. Engine-wise, well, look, you're either for the V8 or the flat six. They're both really good examples of turbocharged, high-capacity, high-performance engines. You can't really lose. Although personally, I'd struggle to say no to this flat six, which I think they've elevated in this 992 GTS package to just such a high level of sort of engagement, performance, and drama. Most importantly, dynamically, the AMG is more forgiving. It's a very expressive car as well. Maybe not as expressive as we'd have hoped. Maybe the four-wheel drive just gives it a little bit too much neutrality, a little too much of a willingness to pull itself straight unless you really do give it a big bung. And it's just less keen to adopt those slivers of oversteer, that there's easy access, torque sustained oversteer that the AMGs have always done so well. So the SL55 lacks that. Maybe the 63 will do it a bit better. The Porsche is a slightly spikier, fightier thing. To drive it on the limit requires a little bit more sensitivity, a little bit more feel, and it requires actually the weather to be on your side a little bit more, but the rewards are there.
And that's the takeaway here. Where the AMG has a superficial charm, the 911 rewards with layers of dynamic character for the driver to explore. The sort of layers any true sports car really does need to have. Sure, the Porsche is less easy to live with, less enveloping and cozy than the SL on the motorway, where its high rear spring rates tend to pump road roar into the cabin, and it's also less immediately nailed down on greasy, unpredictable British roads, where the AMG's immense traction and pliancy make it a truly confidence-inspiring A to B brute. But the 911's lighter chassis is more entertaining, its level of communication and transparency that much greater, and you have to say, in the case of the GTS, it also has the more invigorating and exciting powertrain. The AMG is a fine performance car, a little bit confused, but so capable and so quick. The 911, though, is a truly memorable sports car, and still the car to beat in this class. As ever, thanks for watching, and just make sure to like and subscribe to the Autocar channel.